It was a typical day in 1883. A man named Lou Johnson was in Hop Alley, St. Louis's Chinatown. He went into an alley and never came out again. Authorities later found his head in a rice basket, while his body, covered with many bruises and brutal markings, was found somewhere else. The murder made local and national headlines, and 6 Chinese were arrested, but none were charged due to lack of evidence. However, the exaggerated information was released and created a negative effect on Hop Alley. This story was later used to warn others not to enter Hop Alley, as it was a mysterious place filled with drugs, murder, and other creepy things. Or as the newspaper put it, Hop Alley has been the harbor of the worst classes of the city's population. These kinds of racist ideas were quite common back during the 19th century, especially in places where Chinatowns were established from both coasts to the heartland of America.
Much has changed since the 19th century. Today, Chinatowns are some of America's most diverse cultural destinations. They pop up in large cities such as New York and San Francisco, on coasts, or in Chicago and St. Louis, in America's heartland. For decades, people all over the country flocked to Chinatowns to try authentic Chinese food and experience the interesting culture of China right in their neighborhood.
Chinese immigrants have long been an important part of American history since the California gold rush of the mid-19th century, where an estimated 300,000 Chinese had settled in California by 1862, more than 9% of the population of California at the time.
You may be wondering why? Why did the Chinese come to America? Well, around that time in China, many people, especially the lower classes, suffered from the Second Opium War, which lasted from 1856 to 1860, which created a trade deficit between China and the European powers. The weakened economy, the weak government caused by a massive rebellion, and the taxes didn't help the economic situations. Many couldn't bear the cost of the taxes and decided to explore opportunities in the Californian gold rush. So they left. Many of them was Ala Li. His hometown was Ningbo on China's east coast and south of Shanghai. It was made a treaty port after the Chinese government lost the Opium War with the British Empire in 1842. But mostly of the economic opportunities from America. Many peasants got word of a place in America called Gold Mountain. News of the gold rush traveled all the way to China, and farmers began to think that they could strike it rich in America via the Gold Mountain in California.
But when Ala Li arrived in America, many people already occupied the West Coast, and the employment rate was low for foreigners like Chinese, because the gold rush had ended in 1855. Like many immigrants at the time, Ala Li needed to find somewhere else for money. Since St. Louis developed into the 4th largest city in the U.S. with a booming industrial economy, he ventured to St. Louis.
Chinese left the Pacific West Coast not just to find jobs. They were pushed out because of the escalating racial discrimination. There was a Supreme Court case known as People v. Hall in 1854, in which a Chinese man could not testify against a white man in court. It reasoned that historians believed that Native Americans crossed over to the Americas via the Bering Straits, and thus descended from Asians. And because Native Americans were lesser humans, the Chinese were also lesser humans. This court case might have been one of the worst Supreme Court cases ever, because it discriminated against people solely based on their culture and skin color. Then, Congress passed the notorious Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. The law barred Chinese from immigrating to the USA, making it the only time in American history that an entire race was banned from entering the U.S. There was an exception to this rule, as merchants were allowed to remain in the U.S., including laundry, grocery, and restaurant owners.
Ala Li came to St. Louis in 1857 as the first Chinese person in this booming city. People take pride in being the first person to do something, such as the first person to summit Mount Everest, or the first person to stand on the moon. But it was quite the opposite idea for Ala Li. Being the first Chinese person to settle in St. Louis, most white residents were not comfortable with Ala Li living among them. Imagine what it was like for Ala Li. Daily life must have been extremely difficult for him. But yet, he persisted and opened a tea shop that had good business. Lee's tea shop made a moderate income. They mostly sold tea and coffee to the Irish community in Hop Alley. He later married an Irish lady named Sarah Graham, showing the grit and hard work he put in at the hardest of times. His persistence is admirable, since even in the toughest time, he didn't give up until he was eventually accepted into society. This pattern is repeated among many Chinese immigrants throughout St. Louis and other parts of America.
Ala Lee was the only Chinese immigrant in St. Louis for several years, until the next Chinese immigrants came around the late 1860s. In 1900, there were about 300 Chinese living in Hop Alley. Hop Alley was about 1 to 2 blocks long and built in a ring shape, with each building about 2 stories high. It was located in downtown St. Louis, where the Bush parking lot is located. Back then, St. Louis was much more crowded, and Hop Alley was often next to other buildings as well, but the racial barrier prevented any interaction between them. Most of the businesses at Hop Alley were family-run, such as grocery stores and laundries. Laundries were especially popular. Hop Alley laundries were so popular that they made up 80% of the laundries in St. Louis. One well-known laundry was Sam Wa's Laundry.
Sam Wa came to St. Louis from Hong Kong. Once he arrived, he opened up a laundry business around 1887, washing clothes for 25 cents apiece. In 1912, the business seemed to be doing well, and he opened 2 more laundry shops. By 1915, he was simultaneously operating 4 to 5 laundries in North St. Louis. He eventually hired his nephews from China, Gi Ki-wan and Gi Hong. They eventually inherited his laundry after he passed away. Sam Wa's Laundry was the longest-running laundry in St. Louis. Even though it may seem that Sam Wa was a successful entrepreneur, behind that success was a ton of hard work. Like many other Chinese laundries, everything was done by hand, and often the entire family worked 14-hour days to survive.
To contain the competitive growth of laundries, the St. Louis government passed a law saying that laundries had to be spaced apart by 50 meters. This was one of many policies implemented by government to discriminate against the Chinese community. Remember the Supreme Court case known as People versus Hall in 1854? Chinese people were not allowed to vote. Therefore, they had no representation in the government and court. Law rippled through America and stripped many of the Chinese of their rights, including those who lived in Hop Alley. This voting act often made life very difficult for the Chinese. They had no say in what laws were passed and were stripped from their basic rights that guaranteed by the Constitution. Racial tensions also soared with the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Misinformed white reporters often stereotyped the Chinese immigrants and demonized the Chinese community. One of the local newspapers, the St. Louis Republic, was distributed from 1888 to 1919. On January 14, 1894, it published a cartoon showing the Chinese in grotesque poses and eating disgusting meat such as rats. In the background, a sign in English read, "Stewed rats with fried onions, 15 cents each." The Chinese depicted in the cartoon all had ugly large ears and grimacing faces, holding a chopstick in each hand. An instance of angering words said, their positions were grotesque. The other squatted on the chair seat, knees tucked under his chin, jabbering and grimacing, was forcing hot rice down his capacious maw. Cartoon clearly misrepresented the Chinese culture in Chinese restaurants, warning others not to enter the ugly and disgusting Hop Alley. Such racist news reporting was prevalent. Journalists often reported residents of Hop Alley huddled in dens with hunched backs, smoking opium and withering away in huts. Not surprisingly, many reporters didn't even go in Hop Alley. They just used their imaginations to fill the blanks. As a matter of fact, almost all the houses had backyards as well, which contradicted the reporters' descriptions of tightly spaced huts. The Chinese children even got education from the Sunday schools at church. All in all, the reports of Hop Alley were exaggerated to discourage people from entering the neighborhood and to stereotype the Chinese American immigrants.
Even though Chinese immigrants faced racial discrimination and harassment, they worked hard and survived. An example of this is the laundry shop. Everyone in the family worked from 10 a.m. to midnight, 7 days a week. That's a whopping 98 hours a week, more than twice the average weekly work amount. Everything was also hand-done, as many Chinese immigrants were dirt poor and gave whatever little wages they earned to their relatives back in China. From the scrubbing to the ironing, they labored to make money. This made their job so much harder, but they had to maintain this lifestyle because of their lack of money. Even though they were discriminated against, Chinese Americans still worked long hours doing hard labor to support their families and to survive. One of the most well-documented stories is Lily Hong's laundry. Several interviews have been made with her. She recalled that she and her siblings always had to work and attend school, and when they got home, they had to work in the laundry with their mother. This helps us go into more detail about the lives of people in Hop Alley. Lily Hong had to work all the time. Her family needed to make money 24/7, so when she came back from school, she had to help mother with the laundry. Then she had to do her homework. The only times when she could actually play, she hung out with her friends on the sidewalk playing games. When the Great Depression hit in the 1920s, many of the businesses closed and her friends moved out. Lily Hong remained in the United States despite these challenges, and she raised 9 children, all born in the United States.
Lily Hong returned to Chinatown at the right time. Things weren't looking too good for Chinatown in the 1960s. The Great Depression hit in the 1930s, causing many businesses to move. Kids were going to college, and more people moved out. Hop Alley looked like it was over. It was only a matter of time before it was torn down. Hop Alley's doom came most unexpectedly, in the form of a red bird wearing a baseball bat and carrying a baseball bat. The Cardinals had arrived. The Cardinals were moving into town as St. Louis's most popular team, and they needed a stadium. At the time, urban developers considered Hop Alley a perfect place to put their new stadium. They saw the place as a run-down, old, crappy neighborhood. Construction came very suddenly, and evictions were handed out. People were kicked out via the Red Bird Patrol, and the place was decimated. The once vibrant neighborhood in St. Louis was blown up and became a parking lot in Busch Stadium.
As to the mysterious death of Lo Johnson, the night before he died, Lo Johnson was drunk and accidentally walked into a small corridor and ended up finding a gambling gain. Nobody knows what he did with the gambling gain. Maybe he gambled with them. Maybe he fought the gain. Maybe he just walked into them. How, why, and who murdered Lo Johnson is still a mystery, though, even today. But we weren't recording a documentary about a crime drama. When we started this documentary, we Chinese Americans were looking for our ancestors' traces, footprints, and stories in St. Louis. It was quite difficult because we were not included as part of the local history. This is why we created this documentary. As Chinese Americans living in St. Louis, we hope to remember what the past was like and continue honoring and celebrating our legacy here.